Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan, non-ideological discussion of politics. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about compromise in politics. Is it something we really want? In 2023, Georgetown University's Battleground Civility Poll results showed 83% of respondents agreed that compromise and common ground should be the goal for political leaders. But 82% of respondents also agreed that they are tired of leaders compromising their values and want leaders who will stand up to the other side. And that was just one of the seeming contradictions in people's beliefs on the need for compromise. And that's just one of the inspirations for today's topic. Do we really want compromise in politics? On the one hand, it is important to have convictions that you really strongly believe in, that you really stand up for. There is some truth to the common phrase, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. You have to have a belief in something so that you can effectively advocate for it. But on the other hand, there is a considerable stubbornness that is rampant in today's politics. The very idea of even considering compromise is considered weak and even traitorous by many of the loudest voices in politics. It's an all or nothing approach. So where is this fine line between being strong in your convictions and being willing to compromise? What does public opinion polling say further about citizens' desire for compromise? What are some major historical compromises? What makes compromise more likely or more unlikely? What are some groups that are working on compromise? And how do we move forward as a country regarding compromise? Let's talk about it. So first of all, what exactly is compromise? That seems very obvious, but we need to be clear about what we actually mean. I've talked about it before on the podcast, how it's important to define the words that we're actually trying to figure out how to address them. So, basic definition is simply a situation, like a public policy through passage of a bill, where two or more sides with conflicting views agree to some concessions in order to achieve a solution. So, you need to think about questions like, who is making the compromise? A lot of people think of compromise as between Democrat and Republican, which obviously, yes, that those are compromises that need to be had and are had, but it can also be within a party as well. Sometimes Republicans compromise with each other, or Democrats compromise with each other. You have more ideological to the left Democrats and then more moderate Democrats. You have more ideological to the right Republicans and then more moderate Republicans. And even in state governments where one party is dominant, different factions have to make concessions on what they want. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those specific situations or more general situations. Another question to think about, how much does the magnitude of the compromise matter? So in other words, how far-reaching is the compromise? Is it on one tiny facet of a policy or on a broad overall policy? What if we're talking about an entire budget for the government or just one project having money being spent on it? Is compromise only about the end results of a policy, or can the very act of opening dialogue also be considered as part of a compromise? Now, obviously, just having dialogue does not lead to any tangible results, but at the very least, can there be, say, okay, we're at least listening to what other people have to say and genuinely doing so, not just taking any sort of feedback and saying, okay, yeah, we'll do something about it, and then they never actually do anything about it. How much does that matter for when we're talking about compromise? Is someone compromising more than another person? How do you even quantify that? Oh, this person's giving up 2 concessions, but this other person's giving up 3, or this person's giving up 2 small concessions, and then this other person's making up 1 big concession. How do you define that? How do you quantify that? Our answers to all these questions can influence what we see as a compromise or how much compromising there is. So what about some famous historical compromises that we've seen at least for U.S. history, because American history is littered with compromises, many that we don't even realize were compromises or that have been lost to history. But we'll just focus on a few of the most well known examples. And some of them are good compromises, some of them are not so good compromises, some are in between. Biggest one that you can look at is the US Constitution. Really, the US Constitution is a giant compromise containing several smaller compromises, but we'll highlight several of the biggest ones here. The very structure of Congress was a compromise. You had two competing plans, generally speaking, for the structure of Congress. You had the Virginia plan, which would have been two chambers, representation proportional to state size, so that benefited large population states like Virginia or New York. Obviously, smaller states didn't like that because it would have severely diminished their power, especially when you come from the Articles of Confederation, where each state had one vote on policies pertaining to the nation. You also had the New Jersey plan, which was one chamber, and each state receives one vote. So that benefited smaller population states, and bigger population states would have gone, hey, we have bigger populations. We have more people to represent. Why should they have these smaller states have the same power that we do? And so after a lot of discussion, the plans merged into what became known as the Connecticut Plan, or sometimes called the Great Compromise, which was the two chambers, U.S. House, proportional representation, and the U.S. Senate, equal representation, 2 senators to each state. Another compromise was the selection of the president. Now, this was one of the most contentious problems that really threatened to sink the Constitutional Convention, which multiple times almost fell apart. And a bunch of ideas were proposed at the Constitutional Convention by the delegates, including a direct election by popular vote, which a lot of people want today. There was also the idea that it would be by members of Congress, which many framers supported. There was even the idea of having the president be selected by electors that were selected by a lottery system, and then also an option of doing it by state governors voting. So obviously very different ideas there, and a lot of the debate was how much influence should the people have. You want to have the people have a voice, but then some framers were considered the populace to be too given to a mob mentality. So there was a lot of those discussions there to be had about how we should select the president. Eventually, they compromised with the Electoral College, which was an indirect election by the people. The people do choose the president, but it's through the states that have electoral votes equal to their congressional representation. And if a president wins the popular vote in a state, he wins that state's electoral votes, or she wins that state's electoral votes. And then if you win a majority of the electoral votes that are available, you become president, generally speaking. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that. We've talked about that in the past with how the presidency is, or how the president is selected. And then there was also the issue of slavery. For all the great, ingenious things that the U.S. Constitution did, it had, and still has, flaws like any other document or system of government created by human beings. And in this case, the most glaring and troubling flaw was that it didn't outlaw slavery. Whether the U.S. Constitution or the new nation could have ever happened with the banning of slavery is outside the purview of this discussion. Some people argue that America could never have happened if we banned slavery outright. That's for you to decide. Maybe we'll do another podcast episode, or I'll write about that at some point. But that's outside the scope of this discussion. But one of the major components to this issue was how to count slaves for purposes of representation in the U.S. House. So pro-Southern slaves, or pro-slave Southerners, argued slaves should be counted as full person for apportionment. Of course they did, because that would have given them more power as slaveholders. But then anti-slavery Northerners called that hypocrisy. If you're to treat slaves as less than human beings because you're considering them property, how can you count them fully for representation in government, which makes sense. It's pretty. You want to have your cake and eat it too there. You don't want them to be considered people, but you want them to be people. You only want them to be people when it comes to apportionment in Congress. So ultimately, they settled on the 3/5 compromise, where slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person, and the term slave was not used in the 3/5 clause. I think it was, forget the exact term, but they did not use slaves. This would be eventually repealed by the 14th Amendment, thankfully, but that would take some time before that would come into effect. But they also did secure an eventual end of the transatlantic slave trade, which allowed Congress to prohibit importation of slaves by 1808, though a tax could be laid on those imports. Even some slaveholders were against the Atlantic slave trade because of how absolutely barbaric it was, where you put these eventual slaves into really tight quarters on ships. Many of them died on the way because they were inadequately fed. They were too close to each other, so there's really no room for them to sleep. Disease was prevalent. Even as horrific as slavery is and was, the slave trade was a particularly horrific part of it. But they did secure an end to the slave trade by 1808, or it allowed Congress to prohibit the importation of slaves. Now, moving on from the U.S. Constitution, another prominent compromise that also dealt with slavery much more directly was the Missouri Compromise. As tensions between free states in the North and slave states in the South were heating up, a truce of sorts was created in 1820 called the Missouri Compromise. So Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state, but it also created Maine as a free state to keep the balance between North and South. Maine was originally part of Massachusetts, but then it just became its own separate state. And it also banned slavery north of the 36th parallel, which is approximately the southern border of Missouri. And this stood for over 30 years until being repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which let those two states decide by popular vote whether to be slave or free, even though both states were north of that 36th parallel. Next up, the Compromise of 1877. So, Reconstruction era policies in the wake of the Civil War were meant to, among other things, implement racial equality policies across the South, but those policies had been losing steam. And in the 1876 presidential election, there was a lot of contention about who really won that election, with both Democrats who backed Samuel Tilden and Republicans backing Rutherford B. Hayes, accusing each other of electoral fraud. And eventually they came to an agreement where Democrats would agree to declare Hayes the winner of the presidential election, but Republicans agreed to end Reconstruction in the South. And then just a handful of other compromises to run through here, since I want to get to the rest of the content here. Other compromises include the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We had compromises relating to slavery. Now, fortunately, we had compromises that led to more racial equality. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in businesses and public places, as well as banning discriminatory practices in employment. And if you look at the roll call votes for the bill, or for the final bill, the U.S. House, 157 Democrats and 139 Republicans voted yes on it. And in the U.S. Senate, 47 Democrats and 27 Republicans voted yes on it, because they were able to come to a compromise to actually push it through. Medicare and Medicaid, implemented in 1965. That also had both Democratic and Republican support. In the U.S. House, 237 Democrats and 70 Republicans voted yes. And in the U.S. Senate, 57 Democrats and 13 Republicans voted yes. So once again, a situation where both parties supported the bill. and that was through a lot of wrangling and wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. Food stamp reform in 1977 was engineered primarily by two U.S. senators, Republican Bob Dole and Democrat George McGovern. They sought to control costs more tightly, or by more tightly focusing eligibility requirements to the truly needy while also streamlining the program's purchase requirements. You also had Social Security reform and tax reform in the 1980s with Republican President Ronald Reagan and Democratic U.S. House Speaker Tip O'Neill. And then welfare / government aid reform. You got to be careful how you describe that. Welfare, usually people have a negative connotation on. Government aid, people usually have a more positive connotation on it. But welfare / government aid reform and tax reform in the mid to late 1990s under Democrat President Bill Clinton and Republican U.S. House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Another case of compromise. So now that we've gotten some examples of compromise out of the way, let's talk more about that public opinion on compromise that we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So diving more into that Georgetown poll and the at least ostensibly contradictory opinions on compromise. Now, most of these data points I'm going to bring up are from the 2023 poll, but Georgetown University also had a 2024 poll that didn't ask all the same questions, but some similarities between the two, because overall they were about civility, these polls. And so whenever I mention one from the 2024 poll, I'll make that clear when I do. And you also have to be careful comparing two different sets of respondents by using two different polls, because these are going to be two different groups of respondents that are polled. So you can't necessarily assume that they would have the same exact views on everything. But this is just to illustrate the general point about contradictory beliefs. So some of the positives, some of the things that are more amenable to compromise. 83% of respondents in the 2023 poll agreed that compromise and common ground should be the goal for political leaders, and 54% said they agreed with that strongly. 71% of respondents agreed with the statement that I think it is okay for my side to compromise a little more if it means getting something done. Getting something done is better than getting nothing done. And then in the 2024 Battleground poll, 82% of respondents agreed it will be good for the country if President Trump and Congress compromise to find solutions, even if this means I will not always get everything I want. And then 95% of respondents stated they want President Trump and both parties in Congress to work together. Now, for the negative side, where it sounds like people are less given to compromise. Back to the 2023 poll, 82% of respondents agreed with the statement, I'm tired of leaders compromising my values and ideals. I want leaders who will stand up to the other side. And 54% of the respondents strongly agreed with that statement. And then 77% of the respondents agreed that on the issues most important to me, I think my side has already compromised enough. The other side now needs to give a little. So, how do we reconcile these ambivalent views? Do people really want compromise or don't they? It seems a lot of people really do want compromise, but they conveniently want it from the other side. But if you prod people enough about it, it seems that many will still say, okay, I can give up just a little bit more if it will get results. But this poll also doesn't go into specific issues to see which ones people might be more or less willing to compromise on. Would they be more amenable to compromise on gun policy versus abortion or versus healthcare? It's hard to say for sure, but if you get more into the details of specific issues, there might be less willingness to compromise. They might think they really want compromise, but then you actually try to tell them what they have to compromise on. Now they're really thinking, ooh, do I really want to compromise on that? because now the views on compromise are becoming more concrete instead of a nebulous general philosophy. I want us to come together to solve problems. Now, I'm not saying that I think that people are really full of it, that they don't want compromise, but it does partially depend on how you frame compromise. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways I think we can reframe compromise to see if more people would be more agreeable to it. But there does seem to be some conflicting views people have about wanting compromise. And if they realize that, oh, yeah, I guess if I'm saying I want them to compromise, but I don't want to do anything, I could see how that's not agreeable to compromise. At least I would hope some people could come to that decision. So there is that. I don't can't say for sure, but I think some people don't realize their at least seemingly contradictory views on compromise. And really, it's easy for any of us to say, oh, yeah, I think we need to come together and we need to come up with solutions. I think most people are going to, well, actually, in the poll, most people do say that. But when you actually really get them to think about that, now it becomes a little bit more difficult to figure out where exactly we can have that compromise. But that's the importance of talking about it, to figure things out, to see why people think the way they do. More on that soon. But what makes compromise so difficult to achieve? There's more reasons than the ones I'm going to talk about here, but I do want to highlight some of them specifically. Moralized attitudes. So when you believe your views have a moral superiority, you don't want to budge, because then you're being immoral. It means you are not standing for what you believe in. It means you're letting people who believe in something horrible that they're getting something they want. And it's very easy to fall into this trap. Of course, when we believe something, when our views are a certain way, we're going to think that this is the correct view, because if we didn't think it was correct, then we wouldn't believe that. We would believe something different. But when people have more of that self-awareness of realizing, okay, this is my opinion, but maybe this is not the correct one, I should hear what other people have to say, then it becomes a little bit, the possibility of compromise becomes much more likely. But moralized attitudes are a huge impediment to our ability to be able to compromise and to make progress. And I'll highlight something specifically from Timothy J. Ryan in the American Journal of Political Science in 2017, in a 2017 article. He talked about how moralized attitudes shift behavior from maximizing gains to adhering to rules. So instead of like, okay, I'm going to get whatever wins I can, these little bits of changes in policy here, and it's basically you're standing on principle, you're standing on business. I'm not budging. Other people got to figure this thing out. And so these moralized attitudes lead to citizens, not just politicians, but citizens opposing compromise, punishing compromising politicians, and forsaking material gains. It's that all or nothing approach. Might as well just lose outright if we're only going to get small wins. Another contributor to making compromise difficult to achieve is perceptions that personal values are under attack. In that 2023 Georgetown poll, 72% of respondents felt this way, 59% strongly. And Republicans felt that way more than Democrats and independents did, but still sizable majorities of all three of those groups, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, felt their values were under attack. And if you feel your values are under attack, you're not going to want to hear other people, because you're just going to lash out at them and you're going to stand your ground and say, no, your values are what's wrong. And it just becomes this reciprocal, vicious cycle where we just start attacking each other's values, and we think they don't share the same values that we do. Even if that's complete crap, it's something that we start to believe in. Another reason that can make compromise more difficult to achieve is a lopsided electorate or government representation. When you have an electorate that skews very heavily toward one party, or government representation that skews heavily toward one party, whether that's through gerrymandering or simply because the electorate is just that heavy towards the Democrat or Republican Party, you run the risk of completely shutting out the smaller party. Now, there may be compromise within the Democratic Party if they're dominant, or within the Republican Party if they're dominant, but you're not having any of that cross-party compromise. Another thing that really makes compromise difficult to achieve, and it's one of the biggest ones, I think, is it's really disincentivized by the realities of campaigning. When you're campaigning, compromise is considered a dirty word. Compromising means that you're not having a spine. It means you're a coward. And you see that in these negative targeted ads all the time that trash candidates and officials for being compromising, but saying basically that they're being cowards. They're not standing for things. And meanwhile, these candidates that are against compromise, it's just them being warriors. They're conservative warriors. They're liberal warriors. They're just fighting for common sense. And that's a whole other can of worms. I hate the phrase common sense just because of how overused it is in politics to really describe, oh, this is what I think. That's not common sense. That's just your opinion. But I digress on that point. And especially when you have closed primaries, those are more insular minded. Most voters in these want you to stand your ground because they tend to be more polarized. Because they're more polarized, they tend to be more invested, so they're more likely to come and vote. And oftentimes this is where you hear these accusations of people being rhinos and dinos, which is Republican in name only or Democrat in name only. And I will highlight another academic article by Amy Gutman, I hope I'm saying that correctly, and Dennis Thompson in Perspectives on Politics in a 2010 article where they talked about how the permanent campaign encourages attitudes and arguments against compromise. Because if you feel like campaigns never end, even right after an election is just had, well, it's kind of true, because there's an incentive for them to keep campaigning. We ultimately, as tired as we get about this constant campaigning, we don't ultimately actually react in a way that disincentivizes them from campaigning. I believe there's some countries where the campaign season is set specifically for a specific time of the year and a certain year. I remember hearing that a long time ago. I'm not entirely sure if that's the case, but at least in America, we don't have anything like that where, like, no, you need to campaign in this specific time. Technically, there's no end to the campaigning cycle, unfortunately. But this permanent campaign philosophy, it incentivizes politicians to stand on principle, to mistrust opponents, to say that they're the bad guy, they're stupid, they're evil, do not listen to them. We cannot concede any ground to them. And so this is conducive to campaigning, but not to governing. When you're governing, you inherently have to be more compromising, even if you don't want to be, because that's the only way you can get stuff done. Even if you have a one-party government, or a government that is heavily dominated by one party, there is still some sort of handshake deals that have to go on to say, okay, I'll do this, but you do this, and then we make progress. But obviously, it's a lot harder to get compromise across the parties that way, or across party lines that way. Another contributor to why compromise is so difficult to achieve, obvious one, is polarization. Partisan polarization, ideological polarization. These more extreme views make people set in their ways, and because they're more set in their ways, they're less likely to budge from their position because they got it all figured out. But as I talked about multiple times before, and in other writings that I have, not just on this podcast, especially especially big issue when it comes to polarization is affective polarization with an A. That refers to our thoughts and feelings on each other. We don't want to work together with people we strongly dislike or even hate because it's just it just makes us feel disgusted to do that. So we don't want to work with other people, so we tend to find people that we already agree with, and so we don't listen to those people, we don't bring them into anything, we don't have compromise with them. And then lastly is simply a failure to listen or to try to understand the other side. When people feel like they're not being listened to, they're not going to budge. They don't want to budge. Like, well, if I'm not even going to be listened to, I'm not going to even try to listen to you either. And if you can't actually have compromise if you're not at least listening to other people because you're not getting any other information other than what you already agree with. But that's more of the doom and gloom part. Let's talk about where we do see compromise more often. Because compromise does happen. A lot of times, what gets highlighted is the dissension because that's what generates clicks and views and listens. But there is plenty of working together that we see, not just within the parties, but across party lines. So, where do we see political compromise more often? In the legislative process, this happens a lot, especially in budget negotiations where there's a lot of give and take behind the scenes of, okay, we'll do this project, but you also have to include my project on here, and then we'll include so and so's project. And there's a lot of specific projects that the specific government officials want. So it gets very complex and complicated of what projects get involved on there. Not everybody can get all their projects on there. And there's actually quite a few issues, even in the federal government, where there is a bipartisan consensus and the compromise is actually fairly or relatively easy to get to. But those don't grab headlines like controversy does. So they just don't get as much coverage. International relations and diplomacy. A lot of countries that have a lot of diverse interests, and especially when you consider the capability of war, even nuclear warfare, you do have to sometimes consider compromises. And not only that, but trade policy also has a lot of compromise to it as well. And one way you see that in is an economic term that's called comparative advantage. So country A, so there's absolute advantage and there's comparative advantage. Absolute advantage means you are more efficient at creating one good over another country. Comparative advantage means you have less of an opportunity cost. So if you're going to create good A, how much does that cost where you could devote some of that time and those resources to making good B? So country A might be able to make good A and good B with an absolute advantage compared to country B, but it might behoove them to focus more on good A to send to country B, and then country B focuses on making good B because there's less of an opportunity cost. Country A can't spend all its resources to effectively do good A and good B. So you might have some compromises there where one country decides to send one type of good to another country, and that other country sends a different type of good to country A. That's just one example. Trade policies have different, all sorts of compromises all the time. Another area we see compromise is between chambers of Congress and 49 of the 50 state legislatures. I say 49 because Nebraska is a unicameral legislature. But 49 states and Congress are bicameral. Bicameralism inherently, regardless of whether they're both controlled by the same party or one's controlled by Republicans and one's controlled by Democrats, it inherently leads to some level of compromise because both the House and the Senate need to agree on the exact same wording in a bill. Even if they both have the same general philosophy on guns or abortion or healthcare, they need to agree on the exact same stipulations, which they might not necessarily agree on. So if you have both a state and a house that are Republican, so they'll probably be more likely to be against gun control. And maybe both chambers generally agree on that. But maybe the Senate says, you know what, though, we need to ban bump stocks. And then the House is not about banning bump stocks. But maybe they want to raise the age limit for buying guns from 18 to 21. So the House and Senate might need to work those differences out in some way. So even if it's just one party that controls both chambers, there's still some level of compromise that needs to be achieved. And then the last situation that we'll look at where we see compromise more often, though not by any means the only other one that we see it, is at the local level of government. Although there is a trend of nationalization of local politics, so local politics are being increasingly viewed through the lens of national politics, especially in the really big cities, and consequently, there's more polarization. Local government is still much more amenable to compromise. Why is that? Well, more of the issues for local government are less partisan or ideological compared to federal and state level. So things like fixing roads. Republicans, Democrats, and independents all want good roads. How do we achieve that? Uh, After school programs, if the county has a certain policy on that, that's not inherently partisan or ideological either. There's a lot of different things that are really fundamental everyday responsibilities of a local government that do not have a partisan or ideological bent. Now, there may be some people who try to make those partisan or ideological issues, but generally speaking, those are not issues that lean one way or another. Another reason that local government is much more amenable to compromise is they simply have a much closer proximity to voters. So voters and local officials interact much more. And this interaction leads to decreased polarization, more humanization, and more willingness to compromise because you are seeing what actual people think and feel. When you can actually put a name and face to certain views, it becomes a lot easier to empathize with them. At the national level, it's a lot more dehumanization and saying, well, these people are stupid and evil. This conglomerate of people, they are all this amorphous blob of terrible people. And it's much easier to make people sound like the enemy. If you're at the local level, you're in much closer proximity. You're much more likely to actually encounter them. And so it's a lot harder to do that. It's a lot easier to be a keyboard warrior and talk all this, what word I want to say, but to talk all this, but when you actually encounter people, a lot of those same people aren't so tough like they are behind a computer screen. Funny that. Another reason that local government tends to be more amenable to compromise is that a lot more local races are nonpartisan elections, while a large majority of federal and state races are partisan elections. So most school boards, nonpartisan. A lot of city councilors, nonpartisan. Some county commissions are nonpartisan too. Not always, but a lot of them are. A lot of these local area officials are nonpartisan races, and so there's no partisan cues, which means it's a lot less likely for people to try to rally a partisan base for themselves and try to pit the parties against each other. And all these factors are especially noticeable when you get to really small local governments. So you're talking ones where they serve 1,000 to 10,000 to 25,000 people. The smaller they get, they tend to be less polarized and more beholden to compromise because of those factors just talked about. That proximity, that humanization becomes much more amplified because they're a lot closer to each other because there's a lot fewer of those people within that local electorate, within that local government. So local government is a really good place to look to if you are disenchanted with the idea that government can reach compromise and consensus, because it does happen a lot more at the local level. Now, sometimes, again, local government, local politics is becoming increasingly nationalized, and so it's a lot easier to focus on the times where local government is not being so compromising and not willing to work together, but it does happen a lot more often than you might think. So, how do we reorient ourselves toward a more compromising mindset? Not every compromise works out, and not every one of them is good. We've seen, as we talked about some of the historical examples, some of them were good, some of them not so good, some of them maybe or maybe not were the best that could be done at the time. I mean, again, that's for you to decide, but the at least willingness to compromise needs to be there. But first, we need to effectively demonstrate why we should seek compromise, because progress is most often built on compromise. A lot of people don't think that, because a lot of people think their idea of compromise is it has to be my way or nobody's way. So you really need to hone in and show that progress is much more built on compromise. A lot of times we treat that as a self-evident truth, but for a lot of people, that's not necessarily the case. Some people think it has to be their way. And this all or nothing mentality often leads to full losses instead of small gains. You go back to those moralized attitudes where they'd rather stand on principle and lose than give up any sort of ground to get a small win. Even though those small wins now can build into bigger wins in the future. Like a lot of times for advocates, when they're going to a state government or a local government fighting for something, they might only be able to get a small win, only partially get what they were seeking, but that might be a good stepping stone to the year after. In the next legislative session, if we're talking about the state government, they might be able to get another win there and keep building towards their actual ultimate goal. But when you focus on you need to only stand your ground completely, and then when it's us running the show, that we're going to ram through everything we want to do, that partisan pendulum is inevitably going to swing back and forth between the parties, because at some point, Republicans are going to give it up to Democrats. Democrats at some point are going to give it up to Republicans. What one party does in one term will often just be reversed by the other party when majority control changes. And this ultimately leads to no progress. We just get back to square one, and it just results in more hostility because, oh, you're just reversing everything we want to do. No, you're just reversing everything we want to do. And so we just don't get anywhere. It's also this unwillingness to compromise and the subsequent hostility and anger. It's unhealthy. It's not just bad for our mental health, but it's also unhealthy for political discourse for us to try to stonewall each other. And we need to recognize that we don't have all the answers. Even when we don't realize it, we have a tendency to think that we've figured out everything, that we've figured out much more than we actually have, that we have more of the answers that we actually do. We think we're completely right, so why should we have to budge? It's these other people that are stupid and evil and obnoxious and whatever negative other term you want to come up with for them. Why should I have to give it up? They need to figure things out. But funny enough, when people of different views start thinking that way, just keep butting heads and don't get anywhere. It's funny how we all think we have more figured out than we actually do, and then complain that other people feel that way, that they think they know more than they actually do. Could use a little bit more self-awareness in that regard. But at the very least, we need to be open to discussion and hear each other out. Even if we don't ultimately compromise a whole lot, where one side does get much more of what they want than the other side does, there's the lack of willingness to even be open to discussion. That's what really kills our political discourse. Because if people at least feel heard, most of them will feel better regardless of the results. And I want to point to a couple of the things from my interview with Dr. Guy and Heidi Burgess of the Conflict Information Consortium that they talked about on the podcast. When people at least feel heard, they can at least feel better about the situation, can really tamp down hostility. You need to at least, the losers of an election need to at least feel like they got something out of it. Or the losers of a policy battle need to feel like they got something out of it. Especially because if they get into power next and you were completely hostile to them, they're going to be hostile to you. And then so we're just going to keep having this vicious cycle of polarization. And then also the two fundamental words for political discourse that could really transform how we deal with each other is listen and respect. Not just listening to people, not just letting them talk, but actually respecting, okay, I see where you're coming from. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, and it doesn't mean you have to incorporate everything that they want, but you do at least need to give them some voice in the process. I know there's some people that think, well, I don't owe them anything. No, you do owe them something, because this country is not just for you. This system of government is not just for you. It's for all of us here. And we can discuss and debate about what exactly that looks like, but you cannot just shut out other people. You never come to the best solution by doing that. So, do we need to reframe compromise? Because we talked about some of those contradictory views that people have about compromise. Because when we hear the word compromise, we often think too much about what we lose instead of what we gain. Oh, but I'm conceding such and such. Yes, but you also could be gaining at least a small win on what you want. You at least feel better about yourself. You don't hate other people that don't think like you. We have better discourse. We all come to a more enlightened understanding of things. Those are all the things that we gain from compromise. So maybe there's a different word that we need to use that's not compromise. And especially when you say, oh, somebody's been compromised, that's a negative connotation, because it means, oh, somebody got to them that has a different set of values, different worldview. So maybe not just about reframing compromise, but choosing a different word for it. I'm not saying that that is the case, but maybe that might be something we need to think about. And even if we ostensibly want compromise, we oftentimes, or at least sometimes, punish officials for being compromising and reward those who eschew it. And we sometimes don't even realize it. We don't have to be polarized along partisan or ideological or issue lines to do that. Anybody can be against compromise, especially if they're affectively polarized. Because all of us have things that we just don't want to budge on. And again, there is some truth to the fact that you need to stand for what you believe in. And where that dividing line is between standing for what you believe in and willing to give up something, that's not an easy thing to figure out. But it is something that we really do need to work toward. And fortunately, there are organizations that are working towards that. You have the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is made up of an assortment of people that have worked in government, that have been government officials, that have been involved in policy from both the Democratic and Republican sides, and some independents as well. You have Braver Angels, which really works to bridge political divides and focus on the values that we all share, the fundamental values that we all share, like freedom, wanting someplace safe for our families and our friends, wanting good schools, wanting to be able to put food on the table, wanting to be able to have good jobs. We all want those things. We all have different ideas of how to get there, but we all want those things. But groups like Braver Angels, Builders Movement, various civics organizations all have a lot of focus or some focus on that. And a lot of those places are out there. Just need to find them, and I try to highlight their work as much as possible. And then obviously I try to do my part in trying to bring more compromise, or at least making people more amenable to compromise as well. Because when you start to hear more people and more views and try to understand more of where they're coming from, you tend to see, okay, maybe they have a point, or at the very least, you see, okay, I see why they think that. Oh, this is something I hadn't considered. You'll become much more amenable to compromise that way. So there are people that are working towards that, and those ideals are not dead, and we can work towards them, and we can work towards at least more open dialogue. But we all have to be a bit more cognizant of how we view compromise and our sometimes contradictory opinions on compromise. But that is going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. My links in the show notes, my Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my LinkedIn, my 5-day educational email course about how, not specifically about compromise, but about the very closely related polarization, why we sometimes actually unintentionally make polarization worse, even when we're trying to make it better, why we make those mistakes, and how we can be better and fix those mistakes. My book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive. Not arguing that we should or shouldn't have more independence, but just talking about some of the issues they face and how some of those issues could be at least mitigated. And my Matchmaker FM profile, if you want to be a guest on this podcast or have me as a guest on your podcast, my writings on medium.com and my website, paulrader.org. And with that, we're going to wrap things up. So as always, thank you so much for listening and tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe this podcast and show it to all your friends. And until next time, take care.